Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming along. We normally wait 5 minutes, or not even 5 minutes, maybe 1 to 2 minutes before we really kick off. But while we're doing that, I'll go over just a couple of housekeeping rules. This is, as you can see, an IT Masters and Digital Directors co-sponsored webinar about demystifying directorship, an introduction for aspiring digital directors and technology executives. We welcome you along tonight, and as you may or may not recall, we have two sessions of this. We're trying an experiment where we're running one for the East Coast and one for the West Coast. So if you really like it and you want to hear it again, you can always dial in 3 hours' time and start again. But just a couple of housekeeping things. While I'm doing that, I will also launch a poll. We're interested to see why you might like to have come along tonight and what you're interested in so that we can tailor some of our answers as we go along. So you should be able to see the poll now and be able to answer it. For those of you who have been to some of our short courses before, you know that we run both a chat session and a Q&A. So if you've got questions, bung them in the Q&A. If you just want to talk to each other or say hello, bung it in the webinar chat and we will answer you as we go along. So there we go. We've got it's really only a small number tonight, probably about 15 to 20 people all up. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and a fair bit of interactivity as well. Just a little reminder, don't use the raise hand button because we just generally tend to use the Q&A or something like that. If you keep sending us messages, we will respond as we go through. Anyway, my name's Shane Murphy. I'm the acting CEO at IT Masters this month. And I would like to introduce to you Ben McEvoy, who I recall was going to send me his bio, but hasn't. And so I know very little about Ben other than what we've discussed. He is the chairman, CEO, founder of Digital Directors. He's also a former IT Masters student, a graduate from IT Masters. So he's well versed in what happens when you want to move from being a super tech exec into being a digital director and into the next phase of your life. So please welcome along, everybody, and don't be afraid to say hello in the chat. How are you, Ben?
Hi, Shane. Thank you for that. Yes, I'm very well. Maybe my bio went missing somewhere between me and you. But yeah, great introduction. Thank you. And I guess the other thing to mention is that I'm an internationally accredited commercial yacht master as well. That will come up later because I'm going to talk about boats at some stage. All right, we see a couple more people joining. Should we get
I
started,
think we
Shane?
should just kick into it. By the way, I would note that there is a QR code there for people who would like to join Digital Directors, and we will put it up at the end of the session again as well, because maybe you want to know more after you've heard a little bit from today.
Thanks, Shane. All right, let's get started. So, demystifying directorship. Today, it's something that I hear a lot and I get asked a lot by colleagues and friends and people in my network. What is directorship? Should I be pursuing it? I'm a digital executive, and by digital executive, I mean somebody in the technology space. But I don't really understand what's involved. I don't really understand what they do. And I don't understand why I would do it or how I could even get started. So today I want to talk about what is a director, just do an introduction to directorship and talk about what it is and what's practically involved in being a director. We'll touch on why digital executives in particular might want to consider directorship and why now in particular. And then finally, some practical guidance on how to get started or how to progress if you've already started, but you've struggled to progress. So what is a director? Well, the AICD is Australia's peak body for directorship. And they have a definition of what a director is, but there are two problems with it. The first is, as somebody who has sat through a lot of presentations, I am absolutely allergic to people putting a whole bunch of text up on the screen and reading it to me. Nobody should ever do that or have to endure it. And secondly, the AICD definition is very long and boring. So instead, let's talk about boats. So the period between about the 15th and the 17th century was known as the Age of Discovery or the Age of European exploration. We're talking about Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan. It was a time when previously isolated parts of the world became connected, empires are being built, and people are seeing an opportunity to get very rich by trading across the globe. And the problem was that voyages by ship are very long, they're very risky, and they're very expensive. So generally, only royalty or governments had the cash and the risk appetite to fund these kinds of voyages. But then in 1602, the Dutch East India Company invented a new way. By selling stock to any citizen of the Dutch Republic, they could fund journeys that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise, and more people could share in the benefits of success, and they could also share the risk if something went wrong. But this created a new problem. Where previously a king or a small set of sort of wealthy nobles could hold a ship's captain accountable personally for the voyage, how can you do that now that we've got thousands of individual shareholders in the Dutch East India Company, and the Dutch East India Company have lots of different voyages that they're trying to undertake? So the answer to that was to create what was called the Court of Directors at the time. The Dutch have a different Dutch word for it. In fact, the East India Company, it was the Gentleman's 17, I believe. But the idea was that you would have a small set of accountable people who represented those many shareholders. They would be well connected. They would have access to a lot of information and a lot of relationships. And they would be entrusted by the shareholders to determine the number of ships, the type of cargo, the ports to visit, and crucially, to pick the captains that would then lead the voyage. So the captain would then operate the ship and make decisions as issues arose, and they would often be away for months and years at a time. And this worked so well that basically every other country copied the idea, including the UK, with what then became known as the British East India Company. Well, that was 1602. Now, fast forward to 1767. Venus is scheduled to transit the sun in 1767. Venus is scheduled to transit the sun in 1769, a couple of years later. Now, rare events like this offered a chance for the British Navy to improve their celestial navigation by measuring the exact distance to the sun. So it's very, very important for the entire fleet and for the entire British Empire. But the best vantage point is a long, long way away in Tahiti. It's a very risky voyage. It's going to be very expensive. And if they miss it, the next one happens 105 years later. It's also a great opportunity to collect plant and animal specimens along the way as they transit across the world. So the British Royal Society and a chap you may have heard of called Joseph Banks decide to put together a voyage. So Banks determines the scale and the breadth of the mission and the science briefing. Obviously, the mission is the transit of Venus, but there's also a range of other scientific endeavors that he wants to undertake along the way. So he sets the scope of the mission. And then he also secures funding for the mission. So he himself contributes a fairly hefty sum of money. He petitions the king and he gets some funding from the king and other Royal Society members and other sort of wealthy nobles. Then the Royal Society sets the values and how they want the mission of the voyage to be undertaken. So they focus particularly, it's a science, the Royal Society is a science-based society, and so they issue what they called at the time hints about how they wanted the voyage to behave towards Indigenous peoples. And they emphasized patience, they emphasized consent, and they made a clear point that conquest grants no title over lands as part of this voyage. So they defined a very scientific governance culture. So they've defined the scope, they've got the funding, and then they've defined the culture. Now, James Cook is selected as the captain for the voyage. He's a very experienced naval captain. He receives the funding, he receives the scope, he's given the goals and the hints, but then he is the one who selects the ships, he selects the crew, and he organizes cargo and everything that's needed to be successful in the voyage. So he knows that he will be judged by his compliance with the expectations of the group that's set those values. He'll be judged by his seamanship, and he'll be judged by the results that he delivers at the end of the voyage. He doesn't have an opportunity, or he's not really involved in defining where they're going and what the goal is, but he is in control of how they go about doing it. Now, interestingly, for this voyage, Joseph Banks actually is a passenger on the Endeavour. And it's an interesting way to highlight the difference between an executive role and a directorship role. So while Banks is on the ship during the voyage, even though he's a director and he himself has funded large parts of the scientific elements of the journey, while he's on the ship, he's just a civilian and he is involved in scientific research, but it's James Cook that is the ultimate authority on the ship. And this gives us a sense of the authority of the CEO across an organization, or in this case, a captain. And the director's authority is in determining the overall goals and the mission and the values that we talked about earlier. But once it's in execution mode, it's the captain that has the authority. And there are actually records in Banks's diary and in Cook's where they clashed and they had disagreements. And Banks very often wanted more time to capture and gather more specimens. He was a big botanist, so to gather more specimens and to explore the lands that they encountered. Whereas Cook was undisputedly in command of the ship. He decided on the routes they took, he decided on the timing, disciplines of the crew, and any response to weather, to danger, to conflict. And Banks was actually quite good about it. He always, he never challenged Cook's authority on the boat. He would grumble and grizzle about not having enough time, but he would comply and go along with the timings that Cook set. So Banks sets the funding, the scope, the vision, the goals, the values, and then when it transfers into execution mode, it's James Cook that's in control. So they spend several months, many months at sea actually, and they return successfully, having observed the transit of Venus in Tahiti. In fact, it's there that James Cook opens a sealed envelope that had been given to him by the Royal Navy with some secret orders in it that was only revealed to him after the transit of Tahiti, which is what instructed him to go west and look for Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. And that's when they first come across Botany Bay, which he originally calls Botanist Bay in honor of Banks, later called Botany Bay. They return to England, and after returning, Banks takes Cook's charts, he takes his journals, he takes the measures that he's made along the journey, but it is him that puts that together along with his own findings and his own information that he's gathered along the way. And it's he that goes to the British Parliament and to the King and proposes that Botany Bay is what he called the most eligible site for a convict settlement. And he argues that New Holland's vast land, what was called New Holland at the time, is going to offer a very advantageous return. So it's he that then, following the outcomes of that mission, sets a new strategy. And he then drives what would then be Cook's additional, Cook had 3 major voyages that he undertook. And it's also he that drives the eventual settlement of what we now call Sydney in Sydney Harbour. So I wanted to use that example to illustrate the difference between Banks and the Royal Society setting, sort of acting in the role of a board of directors, and Cook acting as the CEO. So the vision of the organization was to improve celestial navigation. That's set by the directors. The mission is to measure the transit of Venus. That's going to contribute to that vision. And then Banks, as a director, he calculates and sources the funding that's required. He determines the goals and the scope of the voyage. He sets the culture and the values he wants the voyage to operate under. And then when he returns, he defines a future strategy based on the outcomes. But it's Cook. While he can provide input into those areas, he is the authority for day-to-day execution. And that's often the distinction that people ask me about. They say, what is the difference between an executive who seems to run the business and a director? And so that illustrates the difference between the two roles. Now, fast forward to the modern day. Today, directors still occupy that same space, even hundreds of years later. They still occupy that space between those who own the enterprise and those who are executing on delivering the enterprise. You hear the phrase noses in, fingers out. And directors take that as a prompt to be inquisitive, be curious, ask questions. You should understand what's going on in your enterprise, but don't be tempted to directly interfere. Keep your fingers out of the business of execution. That's the purview of the CEO. Now, of course, things are a lot more complicated today than they were back in James Cook's day and Joseph Banks' day. We have a lot more responsibilities. We have a lot more accountability as a modern director than they did back then. For example, some organizations are membership-led. For example, HBF is a membership-led organization, and the board are accountable to the members. And HBF has 1 million members. So imagine having those as your stakeholder, your shareholders or your members. Shareholders, BHP has 5 billion shares, maybe 2 million individual shareholders to which the board is accountable. So the expectations have multiplied many times since the early days of a king and some quite wealthy merchants or nobles. And the expectation of accountability has also expanded. It's not just the funders of your enterprise, but also what we now call stakeholders. So this means that directors are accountable not just to the funders, but to the customers of the organization, the environment that you operate in, the legislation and regulations of the national and state and local governments within which you operate. There are a lot of accountabilities now for directors. By some counts, today in Australia, there are perhaps 108 individual pieces of legislation which convey some kind of accountability onto a director. So things have come a long way. So that's what a director is. But what do they actually do? Again, people ask me this question from a practical sense. What does that all mean? I hear about board meetings, but what do directors actually do? If I was thinking of taking it on, what am I getting myself in for? And the answer is, I think, captured in these 4 elements. So the first is accountability, and I've just touched on that. The legislation in Australia defines some very broad accountabilities for directors, and you have important duties as being accountable as kind of you don't like to say the one throat to choke, so perhaps the one hand to shake. You have to act in good faith in the best interest of the organization. You have to act diligently and carefully. The days of just not turning up to meetings or not paying attention are long gone. There was a case, the Star Entertainment case just recently, which illustrated that. You are required to act for a proper purpose and not to misuse your position or the information you receive in your role for personal gain. You need to avoid conflicts of interest. And a big one is to prevent insolvent trading from your organization. Now, those are just a broad set of accountabilities. As I said, there are hundreds of pieces of legislation which convey other accountabilities that are far more specific, but those are kind of the broad expectations. You need to be setting direction for the organization and doing it in good faith and diligently. Now, the second element is learning. So directors are expected to maintain a breadth of knowledge. While an executive in a role within an organization might say, well, I'm a specialist in HR, or I'm a technical specialist, technology specialist, a CIO, for example. Um, and so I care about, the systems inside our organization. Directors are expected to have much more broad knowledge. So you'll be thinking about your competitors. You'll be thinking about trends in the industry or global trends, economic trends, macroeconomic trends, changes in regulation, emerging legislation, compliance with that, staffing, customers, your community. You're thinking about all of those things in the frames of today, tomorrow, 10 years from now. And importantly, a lot of what you need to do in terms of learning is asking the organization to provide to you sufficient papers such that you understand what the organization is doing and how it is executing, so that you can direct the organization effectively. It is a director's responsibility to request that information from the organization, and the organization is beholden to supply anything really that a director asks for. So there is some the Star finding this last week had some notes in it about directors being a little bit, let's say, short in their expectation of clear communication from the organization, and that falls on the director to do. So the third element is collaboration. So directors, although they are individually accountable for how they conduct themselves, uh, directors make a decision as a collective, as a board of directors. So no one director has the final say. Usually a board will vote, or if there are no objections, it'll just you can pass motions without objection. But it's about meeting, conversing, networking, not just with your board, but with other directors or other members of your community, establishing and maintaining connections with funders, with decision makers, with regulators, the community, customers, other stakeholders. All of that is important. So you spend a lot of time speaking with and working with people. Now, the board meetings are an important element of that, and your participation at the board is very, very vital. You must be adept at presenting your thoughts, raising questions, discussing objections or differences of opinion, but also listening and understanding other perspectives so that you can arrive at a common position, which is the best, agreed best for the organization. So that's collaboration. And the last is thinking. And this is sort of thinking at a different level. And it's about bridging the gap between corporate governance and the execution of the organization. So I use the example of ISO standards. So I've implemented ISO standards as an executive a number of times before I became a director. And what that meant to me was, well, we've got an ISO 27001 security standard, and if we implement that standard, I know I'm doing a good job of keeping the digital systems in the organization secure. But from a director's perspective, to take an example, Section 912A of the Corporations Act says that financial services licensees must ensure that the services are provided efficiently, honestly, and fairly, having adequate resources and competence and risk management systems in place. Now, that's a pretty broad definition, right? What does efficiently and honestly and fairly, what does that mean? And what is adequate resources and competence and risk management? And those terms are, in some ways, deliberately vague, because the expectation is that directors will need to interpret those phrases in the legislation and in other forms of legislation and regulation in the context of the organization that they work for and work in, and apply those things appropriately. So you need to be able to translate that requirement down into what do we need to do for our business. Now, the corner shop is not implementing ISO 27001, right? So at a corporate level, at a governance level, 27,001 is not just an execution layer in terms of making our system safe. It's actually meeting the standard of the regulation. So a director would think, if I am asked by the regulator, did you fairly and honestly and efficiently allocate resources to protect your systems such that your systems were safe for the customers that you were serving? You could say, yes, we implemented 27,001 and we checked that we had implemented it effectively. And then we also went back and we audited that in future. So you would meet that standard. All right, so now let's talk about the time commitments for directorship. So in terms of time commitment, having a board role, one board role, is roughly equivalent to having what I would call a fairly time-consuming hobby like sailing. This is me on the right on the boat called Fusion there. It's not a very good photo because we're at the back, which I don't like. We always prefer to be at the front. But this is me sailing on my weekend crew out of Royal Perth Yacht Club here in Perth. And most people who take on board roles do this in addition to executive roles. So you can think of it as taking on a quite time-consuming hobby. For entry-level board roles, you can expect somewhere between 6 and 12 meetings per year, regular board meetings per year. Each one will be 1 to 3 hours in time. And the big kicker, though, is the pre-reading. So board packs can be as long as 150 to 250 pages per meeting. And you're required to have fully read that. In fact, the gold standard is to have read it 3 times before you attend the meeting. So 150 to 250 pages, that's about a third of a Moby Dick. It's almost a full of Harry Potter, or since nobody reads books anymore, it's about 1,000 tweets. So between 2 and 4 hours worth of reading before you get in the room. In addition to that, you can expect occasional additional meetings, strategy, working session, maybe you'll do a risk session, and maybe events as well, your end of year events. You may have some actions that come out of meetings that you need to take away. You're always maintaining your governance awareness, so you will be reading and learning about governance elements that are relevant to your role. You may get a lot of that passively from your executive role. But you're expected to remain across those topics. And of course, maintaining and growing your network. There's a lot of work in moving in those circles to the benefit of your organization. So you can think of it as it's more time commitment than being an AFL fan, but less than starting your own startup as a side hustle. The final important note here is that board roles often expect you to make a multi-year commitment. So board roles are not permanent usually. You will have a multi-year commitment. Often it's 2 years or 3 years, and that's called a term. And then once your term has expired, you can often refresh your term. So you may refresh it 2 or 3 times, but you will often it's best practice that you would hit you will hit what's called a term limit. And you will no longer be eligible to apply to be a director once you hit 9 years, for example, three terms of 3 years each.
I thought it might be a good time to have a couple of questions.
Sure, go for it.
Before we do that, I'll just share the results of the poll. Most of the people who are here are people who aren't directors and are interested in becoming a director or just curious about it as well. So that's interesting.
Great. Yeah.
To see. I thought there might be a few more people here who are directors without a digital background, maybe who owned their own business and had got into it. But our audience is mostly digital people.
Trying to get a board role and haven't been able to achieve it. I will be touching on that a little bit later as well. We can talk about that. So maybe just before we open up for questions, Shane, let me just very quickly talk about remuneration. And then, because I think that might bring some questions in about what is directorship. So remuneration for board roles ranges from nothing. So there are a lot of not-for-profits that have volunteer board roles. Some reimburse expenses, and particularly for not-for-profits, about 60% of board roles are unpaid for not-for-profits, but that is slowly changing. An entry-level salary for your first paid board engagement might be $10,000 or $20,000 a year. That depends on the time commitment and the skills and experience that you bring, and also the size of the organization. The average director salary across Australia is about $60,000. And if you look by industry background, and this is important for our audience, non-executive directors with tech backgrounds are the highest paid. At about 85,000 is the average salary. And if you're a chair with a tech background, you're about the third highest paid in terms of industries, at about 100K on average. So maybe I'll pause there and we can take some questions. Shane, you're on mute. Maybe I can.
That will help. Okay.
Yes.
So Richard was saying you mentioned directors seek funding and also, give some of their own money in lots of different circumstances, and often they're well connected in the industry. Does that mean that you really can't be a director unless you've got some cash to put in or people with money to put in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So so the answer to that is no. In fact, directors are not required to invest in an enterprise in order to be a director, but it is a pathway to directorship. So if you went to, there's a group in Sydney. In fact, there's one in each capital city in Australia. The Angels, so Sydney Angels, Brisbane Angels, Perth Angels, for example. If you were to invest in a startup, you might, as part of that investment, ask for a directorship or a seat on the board as part of your investment. Usually it's when you're investing a large portion of the round that's being raised, or you have a particular reason why you want to take a board role, but it's not required for you to bring funding with you. And in fact, there are some complications where when you're a shareholder and a director, you really have two hats on, and it can be seen as a conflict of interest. And some people will actually divest from an organization before they take up directorship to avoid that conflict. So yeah, it's not required. It does happen though, particularly in smaller organizations where you take or in VC and private equity situations where you might have a private equity partner who takes a director role within an organization that they've invested in. Yeah. And now ask another question there, Richard. Would you see directorship over more than one entity? Yeah, that's very, very common. In fact, it's a bit of a challenge that gets called out sometimes by the regulator that there's a set of what they call heavily boarded directors. They have a lot of board roles and they do nothing else. They don't do executive work. I myself have half a dozen board roles and I don't do any executive work.
I imagine that's where conflicts of interest come up a fair bit.
Yeah, particularly if you're in the same industry. If it's a not-for-profit, it's not really a big deal because not-for-profits often work together. But certainly if it's corporate roles, you need to be careful about managing your conflicts of interest if you have more than one board role for sure.
Okay. For someone with strong operational infrastructure experience, but no formal board role yet, what's the most important signals or experiences that demonstrates you're ready to be a director?
I touch on this a little bit later. So I would say it's about lifting up into a governance level, really, and having that broader mindset rather than just an executive mindset. So actually, I'm going to cover a little bit of that later on. So for David, stick around and I'll talk about some of those elements.
And do we need to get AICD certification before applying for board roles?
Absolutely not. No, there are no base qualifications required for directorship. A lot of people think that I get the AICD, now I'm qualified, and now roles will come to me. All of the 33% of people here today who have said I've applied for board roles, but I haven't been able to find one, probably have experienced that when I got an AICD qualification. Whereas my board role, like normally that would be like a bachelor's, you'd find your way into a role on the strength of that. That is not the case with directorship. Most directorships are never advertised, about 80 odd percent, and about 65% of them are sourced through personal connections. About 50% of those are through what we would call acquaintance connections.
Great. Let's continue on. We can get
All
to some
right,
of the others
let's
at the
move
end.
on. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Digital Director Challenge in particular. So a particular point in time where we are today, and specifically talking about people with digital backgrounds, technology backgrounds, IT masters, alumni, and why directorship is at a critical moment for that audience in particular. So this statistic is pretty shocking. The University of New South Wales did this research. 80% of Australian boards have no technology expertise at all on them. right? Just take a beat to think about that, right? 16% of directors, if you survey them, will tick a box that says, yes, I have some competence with technology. Between 4 and 6% of directors say that they have deep technical expertise, and less than 1% say they have any experience with cybersecurity, for example. Now compare this to the US, right? Boards are considered digitally savvy in the US if they have 3 directors with deep technology expertise on them, right? 2019 MIT studies show that organizations with that kind of digitally savvy board outperform their peers by about 30% in terms of market cap growth and innovation and so on. There was a set of metrics. And at that time, 2019, about 24% of boards met that criteria. Last year, it was 72% in the US, right? So the US are streets ahead of us. In fact, last year, 16% of all new directors in the S&P 500 had a tech background, and for those that were under 50, it was 33%, right? So why are we different here in Australia? Well, here's the challenge. First of all, tech people don't swim in the same pond as the accountants and lawyers and managers who make up about 85% of our directors. Many tech execs don't even consider directorship as a career option. But just not being in the same room at the same business lunches, at the same conferences and so on, means that people with a tech background often don't have those collegial relationships or even acquaintance type relationships that would lead to a conversation about directorship, right? So that's a challenge. We're just not swimming in the same ponds. Second is I did a search for tech exec, and this is what came up, right? So there is this what George W. Bush called the soft bigotry of low expectations, right? When I speak to people who are recruiting, so executive search for board directors and so on, and others in the industry, and I say, why aren't there more technical people on boards? They say, well, tech people just aren't good at governance. They're just not good at broad thinking. They pigeonhole tech executives as being limited in breadth. And so we have to fight that perception, right? We have to actively broaden our horizons. Accountants have done it, right? Accountants used to be the nerds of the nerds. And now the CPA and the CA, they spend a lot of time advocating for their membership, and now accountants are seen as business partners in the organization, and we need to do the same. We need to elevate the importance of tech in the boardroom and have more people stepping in and advocating for this for these topics. So you need to get more involved in strategy and risk, in the legal and governance and finance aspects of your organization. So that was a question that was asked earlier. Once you start talking about commerciality, about finance, about legal elements, about governance aspects, risk management, that's when you're touching on the skill sets that will make you a good board director candidate. Let's just be honest here as well. We have a communication issue. I make the joke sometimes that when you're talking to an extroverted tech expert, because if he's an extrovert, he looks at your shoes rather than looking at his own shoes when he's talking to you, right? Now, that's very stereotypical, but there is a reason why the stereotype of poor communication from techies exists. We inherently use a lot of jargon, and that isolates people from non-technical backgrounds. The reason I've got this graphic up on the screen is, very famously, when Stephen Hawking wrote A Brief History of Time, his publishers came to him and said, for every equation you have in this book, the readership will halve, right? He had to take out every single equation in that book in order for it to be accessible to the public. And we need to be conscious of doing the same thing. Every 3-letter acronym you use halves the audience that is listening to you, right? Now, Hawking kept E equals MC squared in the book. Whether he halved his readership or not, I don't know, but he fought for that one. He kept one equation in the book. So we are inherently, as techs, we are inherently problem solvers. We think about objective value, what's the best outcome, rather than thinking about subjective agreement of stakeholders, for example, right? We think in different ways and we communicate in different ways. I mean, if you're a tech executive and you've never had the experience of having to implement something that you thought was very stupid because some other executive has just come back from a conference or has been sold on it by some sales guy, then you're a rare breed indeed, and very lucky. That inability, that it's not an inability, the challenge of communicating the value to people who aren't technical is something real and something that we should work on. So we need to learn to tell stories, and we need to learn to remove technical jargon from our language and elevate our communications to a governance level, talking about broad strategic themes and telling stories. That's part of the reason why, rather than reading you a description of what a director is, I told a story about that illustrated what directorship is. And this is the big one. The current average Australian director is a white male accountant, and he's 61 years old. And that means that the nominations committees that are hiring new directors are also white male 61-year-old accountants. So we are combating a self-perpetuating orthodoxy, which reaches all the way back to Joseph Banks and beyond. But there is hope. Women on Boards was founded in 2006, and their goal was pretty self-explanatory: get women onto boards. Since reporting began in 2009, women's representation on boards has nearly doubled. The targets for women on Australian government boards overall continue to be exceeded. Women now hold 54% of government board positions in last year, and 90% of the boards in Australia have more than 40% of women on them. If you're a white 61-year-old male, David, you're in luck. You've only got one criteria to challenge if you're not an accountant. And that is actually what we need to combat as digital directors. So I should say that culturally diverse representation has also doubled in that time. So we've got a group that are combating the white orthodoxy. We've got a group combating the male orthodoxy. And now we are going to combat the accountant orthodoxy, and we're going to replace it with, or add into that equation, digital and technology executives, different backgrounds. That's the next element. And I think if we're successful, we'll probably give the age element a nudge as well, because technology moves pretty fast. And there's no doubt that every generation brings a new and deeper understanding of the current technology of the day. I'm, I think, part of the last generation to have grown up before the internet, when we had to write people's phone numbers. We had to remember people's phone numbers, and we had to, draw down driving instructions on scraps of paper before we had GPS, right? New and younger executives coming through have a place to play in improving the diversity of our directorship in Australia. But digital directors are particularly important at the moment. But there's work to be done. The ASIC chair, Joe Longo, who is a big fan of this cause, he was in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and he bemoaned that despite all of the attention that he's trying to bring to this topic, there has been very little change in the number of technical directors on boards in Australia in the last couple of years. Let me pause and take a couple of questions here, Shane.
It's interesting. I think Richard's asked a couple of questions around the same thing, which is, if you're outside that group, how do you break into the group? Do you do an accounting degree? Do you go to a whole pile of breakfast? What do you do?
Yeah. So let me come to that at the end of the session. I'm going to talk about what you can do to make some progress towards directorship, and also how digital directors can help. But the short answer is it's not a quick fix. Do you need to be a tech executive to get a board role, or are they opportunities for heads of functions and senior managers? There's no requirement. There's no standard requirement to be a director, right? There is no, there's no threshold that you have to meet in order to qualify. Directorship is bestowed upon you by the owners of the organization, whether they're members or whether they're shareholders. And so you just have to be the best person for the job, and you have to be in the right place, and you have to make your case, and you have to be selected. Those are the criteria. So there would be different sets of criteria and different difficulties in achieving that goal, depending on the size of the organization, the nature of the organization, and what it does. So there is no baseline threshold. You don't need an AICD qualification. All of those things might help. More experience might help. More executive experience might help. But there is no threshold. So you don't need to be an executive. You can apply for directorships from any role. How would we get to see this in action, or see the average documentation read and boardroom to see if this is really a fit? Yeah, okay. So there are some organizations that allow you to observe boards. So there's an observership program. And there is also the AICD just ran in Perth a boardroom lunch where they do a kind of a mock board where you can see how the board operates, over lunch. But the reality is, if you're going to become a director and you're speaking to an organization who is considering you for directorship, they will offer you the opportunity to sit in on one of the, and if they don't offer, you should ask to sit in on at least one board meeting before you accept directorship. And if you're interested in a little more detail on that, Richard, you can contact me afterwards, and I can give you a little bit more detail on, what is in board packs and how the meetings operate. I'm happy to share that with you. All right, let's move on. So why now? And I'm thinking about digital directors in particular, right? So why would you do it, and why now? Well, I think our time has come. Australia needs our way of thinking and the diversity of our thinking. I mentioned that Joe Longo, the ASIC chair, bemoaned the lack of more technical directors joining boards. Well, he was in that same speech that he gave to the AICD, he also mentioned that Australia is falling to the back of the pack in the global race for innovation. This is the head of ASIC, the chair of ASIC. Now, he is echoing the sentiment of the recent Productivity Commission report, which shows that Australia's productivity growth has dropped by more than 80% since I was born, right? It is at its slowest that it has been in 60 years right now, right? I hear people describe Australia as a pit and a farm, right? Mining and agriculture make up 70% of our exports and 33% of our GDP. You might remember if you're of my vintage, you might remember a slogan some years ago that was being pushed by the government. They were trying to change us from being the lucky country, i.e. lucky to have land for agriculture and a whole bunch of stuff we can dig out of the ground and ship overseas, to the clever country. You might remember that. This is that same theme, right? Replayed. In order to protect our future, the future of the country, we need to diversify our economy. It's very, very centralized on those primary resources sectors. And what does the Productivity Commission suggest? Well, they say, gee, well, recent developments in areas like AI could turn this around if Australia is able to harness the benefits. They say that it's hugely important that there is a long-run correlation between growth and new ideas, which are the feedstock of growth. They say that new ideas get embedded in investments, right? So who's driving those investments? Boards and directors, right? Investments in capital, investing in new technology, generating new ideas, and embedding that cumulative knowledge into the way the world works. So if you pull up the Productivity Commission's report and you search for the word technology, it lights up like a Christmas tree. It's everywhere through the report, right? So and I'll try and keep it very brief, but here's an example of what I mean. One of the boards I sit on is a mental health board, and we were talking about innovation in service delivery. How can we innovate and serve the people with mental health concerns that we are serving? How can we serve them better? How can we be innovative about that? And I was talking to another director, and I said, "Oh, when I think of that, I think of a project that I was involved in the UK, where we were looking at cardiovascular disease. How could we improve the treatment of cardiovascular disease?" And a team got together, and I was head of the technical team, and we built a set of technology. Now, this was many years ago, before big data and a lot of the tech we have today. But we built a set of technologies that allowed us to pull a bunch of data together and to do some analysis and to work out how to more effectively diagnose cardiovascular disease. And then we examined the data and we worked out the best way to treat cardiovascular disease as well. That research was put together then by a group of very smart medical researchers and submitted to the Royal College in the UK, who adopted the findings and pushed that training out to the GPs in the UK, who then detected and used our research to detect and treat cardiovascular disease differently in the UK. They did, that was in 2007. They did a retrospective in 2022, 15 years later. 135,000 people had been impacted by that new way of thinking, that innovation to treatment. And we saved 1 million years of human life. So that's what I think about when I think about innovation in service design. And I told this other director that story. And she said, "Well, I've been thinking about the way that we schedule nurses and different medical experts to interact with the clients and the people who need it. We can do the schedule of care differently, or we could have them come to different locations, and we could be innovative about how we bring in different skill sets." And we talked about it a little further, and we said, both of us are talking about innovation, genuine innovation in service design, but we both have completely different ways of coming at it, right? And she said to me, she said, "I never would have thought of using our data and looking at how effective different treatments have been to inform the way that we might move ahead with innovating with services. It never even occurred to me." So the importance of having a different way of thinking in the room plays itself out in those kinds of conversations. And we need more digital directors with those data-based and systems-based ways of thinking to bring that into our boardrooms to drive the kind of innovation that I'm talking about. So they need our way of thinking. And let's face it, businesses today are unavoidably involved in tech. Tech is in everything that just about every organization does, right? In 1975, a study was done of the S&P 500 in the US, and there is a measure of what they call intangible value. That's the difference between what the stock market is valuing, the market capitalization of the business, and its assets, its actual concrete assets. What does it own in terms of plant and equipment and property and so on? And that's called the intangible assets. Back in 1975, that was about 17% intangible. About 83% was tangible things that the organization had. Today, it's 92% intangible assets in the S&P 500. And what makes up the vast majority of that? Digital assets. It's data, it's systems, and it's the way those are operated, right? Networks. So if you ask a CFO, what are the most important assets that you have, many CFOs will talk about money in the bank, right? And how we're investing it, and the physical assets that we have. They don't think as deeply about the digital, the intangible assets, as what technologists do. And it's now representing an outsized proportion of the real value of organizations, right? Our headlines are awash with news feeds of systems outages and data breaches and emerging digital governance challenges like AI and quantum computing. And there have never been more tech governance issues on the agendas of AICD meetings, in the AICD magazine, in every conversation I have in directorship. Richard's asking about cybersecurity. Everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. It's the number one risk when surveying directors in Australia is cybersecurity and data protection. That's their number one risk. The number one threat is digital disruption. So whether that's internationally, from competitors or even internally, being disrupted by use of tech internally. And the number one opportunity is AI adoption and transformation. So all of those are digital, right? We have a place to play in governing those and contributing to the governance of those organizations on those key matters. I'm going to quote Joe Longo for a third time. There isn't a single material issue facing our institutions that doesn't require data, systems, technology, and processes to effectively address. That's the chair of ASIC in Australia, right? 43% of boards added ICT to their skills matrix last year. That's the moment we're in. So, bridging the gap. There has never been a greater call to arms than Australia's current economic and productivity climate. Tech has never been more important, and it's never been more important to organizations, and it's never been more important in the boardroom, right? These factors together give us the opportunity, in the same way that Women on Boards has, to challenge the orthodoxy of what a director is and to bridge that gap between the few digital directors in Australian boardrooms today and a new orthodoxy that every board member must be digitally competent and every boardroom must have digital expertise. So how do we get started? It's a long road. Becoming a director and then growing a directorship portfolio is not the same as answering an ad on Seek, taking an interview and getting a job. It's a career vocation. It's not an employment opportunity. So you have to be ready to commit over a long term, and it's non-deterministic, right? The question was asked before, how do we get started? Well, first of all, you have to make that commitment in your head. You should think about your profile. The question was asked, what do we need to have a profile that's attractive? And I mentioned some of the elements around governance, risk, finance, exposure to commercial elements, legislation, regulation, compliance. If you're operating in those areas, then you have a good board profile that would warrant consideration. If you don't, then you should be actively seeking exposure to those concepts and principles. Development. Nobody is a perfect director when they start out. I've learned a lot myself. Learning, taking coaching and taking mentoring, particularly from directors who are in roles. Those are all very, very valuable in lifting your skill set, not just your skill set, but your personal capabilities. I talked about communication and storytelling, for example. That's a really key one. But there are a range of others that are very valuable when it comes to seeking directorship. The next thing is value proposition. So people have a tendency to say, I'm an executive director, I'm a digital executive, I've got lots of experience, and I've done the AICD course. So therefore, that's my value proposition. You need to be much more specific than that, because boards will be looking for directors who can specifically contribute to the outcomes of their organization. So you should be very deliberate about thinking about what is my specific value proposition? What can I add to this organization? So for me, for example, I have a big background in tech and in health. And so when I go looking for directorships, that's what I target. I target those. And then networking. And we talked about deliberate networking before, and the question was asked, well, how do we get into those clubs? And the answer is just lots of hard work and lots of time. You need to decide which events you're going to attend. You need to be deliberate in who you speak to and what message you pitch. Often, I like events where you get put on a table, because people will just speak to you on a table, right? And you'll get, you'll make 8 or 10 contacts just by sitting at a table. And sometimes I'm cheeky and I move tables at some point halfway through, so I get 20 contacts, right? But being deliberate about how you network, when somebody speaks, going and speaking to them afterwards, often you'll be surprised how receptive they are. They say, hey, great speech. Let me ask you some questions, or let me connect with you. But being deliberate about your networking and pursuing the connections that you're trying to make. And digital directors can help with every one of these aspects. And so if you're interested in membership, I encourage you to join and connect with me. And I'm happy to put you in touch with coaches, mentors, training institutions like IT Masters.
I, I
So
think
that's,
also it's worthwhile saying that networking is a skill that you can do even if you, and I was speaking sort of to Richard here in some respects, but also to many people in tech who are by nature potentially a little bit introverted and
yep.
are nothing terrifies a lot of those people more than going into a room full of strangers and having to talk to people. And
Yeah.
that is a skill that absolutely can be learned. You treat it like a job and you do it as another skill like a job. And I've been in that situation myself.
Mm.
Had to do a lot of that stuff, and you can actually learn that skill from the basis of being a techie person without those contacts. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot about taking a deep breath. And actually, one of the offerings that we're putting together at the moment at Digital Directors is what I call a networking pod, where we go as a group of 2 or 3 people and we encourage people to network in a media, at an event. We say, okay, you're going to go and speak to this person, give yourself, 2 minutes. I'll come and rescue you if you need to be rescued, and so it can kind of reduce the fear of networking by having some people around you who are supporting you and encouraging you. So that's something that we offer out of Digital Directors as well. So look, that's the last slide, Shane. Digital directors, I think, have a unique chance to today to disrupt Australia's corporate orthodoxy. You have a unique chance to enhance your career and to participate in leading Australia's future prosperity. It's a nice thing to want to be part of. So I encourage you to be part of the journey, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Absolutely. It's a great time for questions. And also, just while we're doing that, we've got another little bit of a poll about, where you might like to go from here. So I've launched
Oh
that
yeah,
just so that
yeah.
you can have a quick think about that while we're chatting. David, so how do we do it if we're based in regional Australia?
Yeah. So um, there's a couple of answers to that question. So obviously, opportunities are fewer and further between in regional locations. That's just the way it is. But by the very same token, your opportunities to network and to connect with people are probably better. Just fewer people means that there's fewer steps between you and whoever it is that you need to speak to get yourself onto a board. One of the things that a lot of people do as their first step towards directorship is go and look for a not-for-profit and volunteer your time, right? So one of the AICD events I went to recently, it was the head of a fishing society for a region in Western Australia, for example, and they had a board and they were, overseeing a set of assets that they'd collected over the years. And he was looking for somebody to come and help him on the board and so on. So those kinds of opportunities, if you go looking for them, if you're passionate about fishing, go and look for the not-for-profit fishing related societies in your area, right? And turn up to their events, speak to the senior person there, express your interest. And really what you want to be doing is have done sufficient research to volunteer your skills and experience in a way that they recognize will be valuable, right? So you might go to them and say, hey, I saw in your latest newsletter you were advertising that you need a new CRM system. I'm actually really good at tech. Not only could I help you with that CRM system, but I could probably help you find the right one and help you buy it in the right way and help you keep it up to date. And have you thought about cybersecurity? I can help you with that as well, right? So you can pitch your value proposition to an organization that's expressed a need for that. People are asking for the email, so I'll go one step further forward. The website is digitaldirectors.com.au, by the way. If you want to connect with me, the QR code will take you to our LinkedIn group, or you can look me up on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect with you on LinkedIn.
Great. Sean's asking, we didn't cover specifically things like indemnity insurance and how that's managed.
Yeah. Was there a specific question about indemnity insurance? I mean, indemnity insurance, essentially what it does is it says if somebody tries to sue you as a director because you're accountable for the organization, then the company, I mean, it's I would require it as a director, right? So it's yeah. So Sean's asking, yeah. So I would expect the organization to pay for it, right? So if you're taking on the accountability as a director of the organization should be prepared to insure you. So it's called directors and officers insurance, D&O insurance. Often it's not that expensive, so the company should be prepared to protect you. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't indemnify you or protect you against fraud or malfeasance or doing the wrong thing. It just helps to cover the legal costs of fighting claims made against you if that's what you want to do, right? So an arbitrage across legal costs.
Excellent.
And the
Any other
company
questions?
should pay.
Nima wanted to know which board you're on, international board.
So I sit on, yeah, I've got half a dozen boards. So I have a couple of corporate boards, a couple of not-for-profits in mental health and disability, and then I have a couple of startups. And for my sins, I also chair my Council of Owners board, which is it's a lot better now, but most other boards have a shared purpose, which is really useful because everybody's trying to pull in the same direction. And a council of owners, of course, it's just people who live there. So you get a lot of different opinions, and it's a real exercise in bringing people together and trying to mediate and find collaborative outcomes for a pretty disparate group. So that one takes up probably more time than it should.
I should also mention that we will, in either tomorrow or very soon after Easter, be putting the video from tonight and also from later tonight, one or other or both, up on our YouTube channel and also on the IT Masters website. So you'll be able to revisit if there's things that you wanted to think
Mm.
about.
Uh,
And Pratap said, ACS members automatically get indemnity insurance as part of their.
Yeah, I think you'll
That's a
find
bit
that's
different.
professional indemnity insurance rather
Yeah,
than directors and officers indemnity. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Any more questions from the group? It's been a small but lovely group tonight, and we thank you for your time as always. We've tried to keep it down to not much more than an hour. And if you're really excited, you could come back again at 10 o'clock Sydney time or 7 o'clock Perth time, and we will be repeating the session. There might be different questions as well, so we'll try and make them appeal across the board. But thanks again to everybody for coming along, and thanks very much to you, Ben, and we look forward to speaking to you all sometime in the future.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.